Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mike, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, man. How you doing?
Fine.
Mike, I brought you on here to talk about the JFK assassination because, there's so much out there, honestly, when it comes to the JFK assassination. I've talked to so many researchers with independent theories, and everyone seems to focus in their own specific areas. And the first time we talked about the Zapruder film, and we talked about backyard photographs, which I still have some questions on the Zapruder film that I'll probably ask you later in this chat. But when it comes to what brings out, in your mind, evidence of a conspiracy, doesn't need to be the shooter who does it, but it can just be a cover up, which I've kind of talked about multiple times, is that there's a lot more evidence to support that there was a cover up going on, whether it was to make sure it was this lone theory. But the easiest statement you can make is that if you're doing an investigation of the president's death, who knows that it's a lone shooter and it has to be a lone shooter within 24 hours? Knocking out anything like a getaway driver or anything of that sort, but they said no, it was just Oswald within 24 hours. That doesn't sound right off the bat.
Yeah. Well, that was Hoover. He was driving that from the get-go.
So when it comes to evidence, when we talk about things in your mind that stand out as some really key points, stuff that you focused into and been able to look into.
Well, I think the medical evidence is just overwhelming now. I think it's compelling. You have the fragments on the back of the head that, of course, even Larry Sturtevant, who was a ballistics expert for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he has admitted that there's no way that a full metal jacketed bullet would have left any fragments on the back of the head. They just don't behave like that. And it wasn't even at the proposed higher entry site. It was below it and a little bit on the side of it. But he has said that there's just no way that an FMJ round would leave any fragments on the outside of the skull. And then you have the brain evidence, where it's very clear that the brain that was sectioned and examined later, a week later, could not have been JFK's brain. It had way too much material in it, too much matter in it. Everybody who saw the brain said at least a third of it was gone.
And if you look at the back of the limo photos as well, too, you see that it looks like it's splattered all
see
over
all
the
the blood
seat.
and brain, all the brain matter all over the place. Yeah. And then you also have the fact that the doctors, the autopsy doctors, described damage that was clearly made by two bullets, one high in the skull, one low in the skull. There's the high fragment trail that's on the x-rays now. That's very obvious, yet there's not a word about it in the autopsy report. And instead, the autopsy report says that there was a low fragment trail that began slightly above the EOP, the external occipital protuberance. It's the bump on the back of your head. They said it was slightly above that, and that it went up to a point just above the right eye. Well, there's no such fragment trail on the x-rays as we now have them. And also
well, can I ask how much of a big mistake is that? Like, I know we talk about Parkland Hospital. You have a guy put a trach tube through a little hole that was in his neck. Opened it up and put a trach tube in there. But they also didn't know they didn't have much experience doing autopsies before, from what I've been told. But then you get to Bethesda and you get to the actual medical center where you're dealing with the head and the brain. When I see photos of Kennedy's head, if you watch the Zapruder film, it does not match. To me, it doesn't match. It looks like you see a giant cloud of mist pop out the front of his head. Like if something, whether it was an explosion, whatever you want to say, it can be back, front, I don't care. But it goes into a point where you take the Zapruder film and you match it with the actual photo of Kennedy, and his face is like fully intact. The only thing is like where they pulled his scalp, and it's like this whole area looks like. So when you look at that, you just go, one of these is not right. I'm more likely to believe that the autopsy photo is the actual photo and the Zapruder film is then edited. But then, you can make anything in any of this case. There's so much evidence. You can make anything fit any direction you want it to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, like you look at the at the autopsy doctor's description of the damage in the brain, there was very low damage down in, it was near the center of the brain, really low, which matched up with the EOP entry site. But then you also have damage that was 2 or 3 inches higher, and there was nothing connecting those 2 lanes, those 2 tracks. Yeah. And you asked how much of an error it would be to say, you know, to look at an X-ray and say, well, this high fragment trail that we see in the X-rays now, that was actually just above the EOP. That would have been a mind-boggling error. One, because they were at least 2 inches apart. I mean, you're talking about up here as opposed to down here. I mean, it's, you know, even a first year medical student would never make that kind of a mistake. It's just wildly implausible. It's, you know, it's just fantastic. And so the problem that they had, I think, on the night of the autopsy was that they had very clearly 2 wound tracks through wound paths through the head. One was high, one was low, and there was nothing connecting them. There was no, like, you know, you didn't have a path up here and a path down here, and then a path going from one up to the other, or from the high one down to the other. You didn't have that. And so they had to make a decision. Well, okay, we can't describe both of these tracks, or else people are going to think, well, wait a minute, this looks like 2 bullets if there's nothing between them. And so I think they made a decision that they would just ignore the high fragment trail, and they did. It's not mentioned in the autopsy report, not one word. In fact, it's not mentioned in their testimony either. And yet, when the X-rays were released,
Oh, wait, is that a
lo and
question?
behold,
Is that a question that could have been asked to them when they're given their testimonies? Is that a question that
oh
was
yeah,
left out, or was that
yeah,
something that was just
like how did you
taken
miss
out?
this? How could you have missed this? Yeah.
Because I know we talk about like a cover up. I'm just wondering how many people were actually in on it. I think it was a couple people from the top, obviously, that because you're like the weirdest thing is that when you get into the community of JFK, they always say you can't trust a witness testimony. But then that sometimes people on the other side or conspiracy side will be like, that's a bad witness. It's like kind of just shouting at like different levels of witnesses and without any reputation basically to them. You don't have to explain who the person is or if they've ever lied before, just about you can't use that witness. This witness said this. It's like you're still using a witness in the long run. So it's like kind of hypocritical there. But you get into a point where if you can't trust witness statements, which I consider them the most valid out of them all, the 70 or 90 something people that said that they saw a giant hole in the back of his head, especially Clint Hill as well too. But then you rely on the evidence, the forensic evidence or the medical evidence. But I go, well, who's in charge of that medical evidence or forensic evidence? The people that are going to give it to you or give you the answer, it is the people that you suspect them of doing the act. So it's kind of like Hale Boggs in 1971 when he was calling out J. Edgar Hoover. He said, Hoover's wiretapping people and doing all this. And then the reporter goes, what's your evidence on that? He goes, well, you're asking the FBI to investigate the FBI. Like, they're not going to, well, you need a nonprofit organization or another committee to do all this type of stuff. And everything that he was talking about ended up becoming true after Watergate. So, I mean, it just gets to this point where you're like, if you can't trust the medical evidence, you can't trust the ballistic evidence, can't trust this, then you have to go with the people that were there that day. And it had to be so traumatizing to them. And I have to then look at their accounts. Like, how detailed was it? If I have 90 something people or however many people seeing a back hole in the back of his head, and then we have a Harper fragment where no one knows where it's at, and it looks like you could piece that little piece to the back of his head compared to what everyone else says it was the top of the head explosion. I'm like, well, look at the autopsy photographs. They don't show a giant chunk missing out of here. They show a whole destruction back here, like towards the back of his head.
Yeah. Well, the Harper fragment, of course, it has vanished. Once the FBI got it, it vanished, which is an amazing thing in and of itself. But of course, in Dallas, three doctors examined it, actually handled it, and they were the ones who had photos taken of it, and we have those photos, and they're very clear, high quality photos. But all three of those doctors, one of whom was a neurosurgeon, they said that it was occipital bone, which is bone from the back, the very back of the head. They all said. I mean, the only doctors who actually were able to handle that fragment, to hold it, to turn it upside down, to look at it, at different angles, all of them said that it was occipital bone. And of course, David Mantek has done some great research on this, and I think he has shown fairly conclusively that it has to be occipital bone, that it is occipital bone.
Does anybody know where the last whereabouts of the Harper fragment were? Like, how does that go missing?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, it was handed over to eventually to the FBI, and then it vanished. It's not in evidence. There's no record of it after they got it. It's gone.
Now, I mean, even with Kennedy's brain being missing, can't you look at the skull, or is there an issue because maybe some manipulation? Like I know David Lifton talked about manipulation of the body post surgery. I think there's even a document that, and I know people say, well, the guy typed it wrong, and I was like, all right, well, that's a lot to put in a document if you're going to accidentally make a mistake and say manipulation of the head area. But do you think that the body was manipulated in a sense? Like, I wonder if we could just look at the skull and be able to tell by the skull if there's a certain chunk of it missing out of it.
Well, Dr. Humes, he was the chief autopsy doctor. He said at the when he began to examine the head in front of others. In other words, when the official autopsy started, he made the comment that there had apparently been surgery to the head or the brain, and an FBI agent who was there, he wrote this down. He noted this, and I think that Doug Horn has developed some really good evidence that there was a pre-autopsy examination of the body where they altered the head wound as much as they could. They had to remove some fragments and things like that. We actually have a couple of witnesses who saw it. One of whom was a direct witness. The other one is hearsay, but it's credible, I think. And then
Why do you think they're credible if it's hearsay?
Because they had no reason to fabricate it, and at the time they didn't realize that they were describing anything. I mean, they didn't realize that this was not the main autopsy. They just assumed everything was okay, was legit. But they, and so these were people who had no conceivable reason to invent this.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the back of the head photos, when the FBI agents, Siebert and O'Neill, were shown those photos, they said, well, this is not how it looked. In fact, one of them even said it looks like it's been faked or doctored or altered. He actually said that to the ARB. And apparently what happened was that the, that after the autopsy, when the morticians reconstructed the skull, that the back of the head photos that we now have are the photos that were taken of the reconstructed skull, not of the skull as it was at the time of the autopsy, but after the autopsy, because there was a flap, there was a very large flap, back there, and apparently what they did is that once they had the head reassembled, then they took some more photos, and those photos, at least of the back of the head, are the ones that we now have, although they weren't done during the autopsy.
Are there any
That
photos
explains a
lost from?
lot.
Are there any photos lost from the autopsy? Whenever I see those photos, I wonder when they took place, because you have Kennedy with his eyes wide open, his mouth open, laying on a table, and his neck kind of back like this. And then you have another angle, which is from like the top of his head, and it's hanging off the table. And I'm like, is this after they messed with the head at all? And then I've seen later photos where the whole right side looks like it's just manipulated. So they re-put the head back together, like the skull back together.
Well, like when the ARRB interviewed Sandra Spencer, who processed some of the autopsy photos, and they asked her, are these the photos that you developed? And she was emphatic. No, this didn't. The photos that I developed, his head looked nothing like this in those photos.
She said that he didn't look this bad.
Yeah, and of course, we know that there were a lot of photos that were taken of the chest, of the neck area, that were made when there were probes in the wounds. Those aren't in evidence anymore. They're gone. Even Hume said he distinctly remembered having some photos of the chest cavity taken, and that makes sense since they were trying to find out where the back wound went. And we have overwhelming evidence now from the accounts of the unsealed documents that on the night of the autopsy, the doctors were absolutely sure that the back wound was shallow and had no exit point. And Boswell even admitted this to the ARB, that at the time that they could stick their
Tip of their finger
in the wound and a probe in the wound, and they could not see where they could see no entry into the chest cavity. And in fact, there were Dr. Carney even said that he was watching this, and he heard a number of the people around say that they could see they could see the end of the probe pushing up against the lining of the chest cavity. So that means that wound had no exit point. It stopped. Might have been a misfire, and that would explain why a lot of the witnesses said that one of the shots sounded different from the other shots. So if that back wound shot was a misfire, then it would have been shallow. And so
I didn't know about that. I would have thought two different guns with two shooters.
Yeah, well, you would have one shot going into the back, and then you would have something. I think it was a piece of the windshield going into the throat.
Have you looked into the bunch shirt theory, which is when they talk about that's why that wound looks like it's back there and it kind of came out his throat? I think that's how it goes. I haven't really looked into it because it just didn't make a whole lot of sense. But They talk about like turning at the right angle and it goes through a bunch of muscle fibers or something like that at like the perfect time. I'm like, okay, so the bullet is just one of those that just it was going to find its target either way.
Well, if you look at all the photographic evidence um, from the motorcade, now his coat was bunched up some, maybe an inch the most, inch and a half, if you want to be generous. But it was not bunched in the right place to allow to explain why the holes were over 5 inches lower um,
Well, when you see him go like this
below the collar. Yeah.
and do that, then you see the shirt bunch up. But before that, there's not really
Well,
a
the
bunch up.
shirt. Yeah. Well, see now the shirt um, was a tailor-made shirt, and he was sitting on the shirt. I mean, against the seat. So there. I mean, that would have held the shirt down. Plus, of course, his shirt collar was buttoned, so that's also going to make it hard for the shirt to move much. Plus, you also had the coat on top of the shirt, and so the idea that the shirt uh, could have bunched in almost perfect correspondence with the coat. I mean, like it would have almost had to be, uh, square inch by square inch, almost exactly matching how the coat bunched, and that's just, I think it's just crazy. It's
He was wearing a tie, wasn't he?
yes, it was. Yeah, he
Could
had a
you be
tie.
able to look at see if the tie was messed up at all, if there was a wound in his neck?
Well, we don't have any um, pictures or footage that show his tie after the shooting started. They're just not, because he has his hands up as he emerges from behind the freeway sign. He has his hands up to his throat. He's trying to clutch at his throat, and so you can't really see his tie. And then he gets, and then at around frame 226, he gets jolted sharply forward. Now that's obviously, I think that's the back shot, and I think that the shot that caused him to start to move his hands toward his throat. I think that was the throat shot, and those are clearly two separate shots. The first shot came before the freeway sign. It started. I mean, even the HSCA photographic experts said that he starts to react at around frame 190. He's waving, and then all of a sudden his hand freezes, just stops in place, and he starts to bring his hands down toward his throat, and then of course that's at frame 207. You can't see him, after 207 because he's behind the sign for a split second, and then as he emerges, you can see his hands are up at his throat, and then after that point, then he's jolted forward, and really this reaction is one of the most obvious in the Zapruder film, second only to the headshot, of course. But if you look at the Zapruder film, starting in frame 226, going to about frame 232 or 233, he's jolted visibly forward. His arms are flung, his elbows are flung up. He's jolted forward. Obviously something hit him in the back. I mean, it's hard to avoid that conclusion.
I would say I would agree with the Gil Jesus on this one because he talked about it looked like a bullet had hit him in the throat. and he looked like he was trying to cough something up. Like if you had something, and I would think it wouldn't just be a straight shot right at him, but I mean, if you look at the windshield aspect of things, and I know that's safety glass, so if it's possible that a fragment or something could have went in there. I mean, if you look at the motorcade damage, there wasn't just little dings on the side of the motorcade, but there was a right above the rear view mirror. There was a whole dent from a bullet hitting that. There was one that fell back into the seat that John Orr tried to do his whole, recreation of the scenario. And that wasn't submitted into evidence. So it was like, where did that go? And there was like a lot more than obviously just two shots being fired. And I try and bring this up a lot of times when you talk about like, because I'm sure you've probably seen it through the community, but there's like a sign of patriotism to like agree with the government on this one, which is just like the government's going to do their job. And that's when I bring up like the Warren Commission, for instance. I think everyone knows that it was like however many members, but they all had amazing resumes, uh, really good careers in the military, and everyone goes, well, their word's going to be good, right? Earl Warren's word's going to be good. But then it's like, how many interviews did they attend when they were doing the whole, investigative process? Well, not that many. And then you kind of look at just the whole aspect of people just seeing their authorities say one thing and be like, that's good enough for me and move on. But you got to bring up the main example, which is it's an investigation. Who does the investigation? People. What do people do? They make mistakes. For instance, 3 shots fired at Kennedy, all of them hit. And then James Tague comes out of nowhere saying, no, I had a piece hit a cement block, and then the piece came up and hit me in the cheek. And then now it goes to 3 bullets that all hit Kennedy. Now it's 2 bullets. But now we have other bullets that damaged around the motorcade. So unless these bullets had rubber on them and they're able to just ding right into somebody and start bouncing all over the vehicle, there was more than obviously 3 shots fired.
Right. Well, and they we know from the Warren Commission records that they recognized even before the James Tague incident became widely known, that they knew that there was a problem with the reactions of JFK and Connally, and so they knew that they had to that saying that there were 3 shots that hit the target, that 2 hit JFK, 1 hit Connally, that was not going to work. And then along came Tague, and then they really said, okay, well, we definitely can't have 3 shots hitting men in the car, and so therefore they had to have the single bullet theory. But as far as the government, it's interesting. You talk about patriotism and the government, and saying, well, if the government said this, then I'm going to agree with it. Well, the government later changed its mind in the form of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which, of course, reached very different conclusions than the Warren Commission. The HSCA said that there were 2 gunmen who fired at JFK, that one of the shots came from the front, that Jack Ruby had extensive mafia ties, that somebody helped Ruby get into the basement of the Dallas Police Department to shoot Oswald, that Oswald had an association, some kind of a relationship with David Ferry, Clay Shaw, and Guy Bannister. I mean, it actually says that in the report. Now, they don't go into any. They say it was like an unspecified or an unidentified or an unclear relationship, but that he did. They acknowledge that he had some kind of an association with those 3 guys, and of course, that raises all kinds of questions. Why would a Marxist be hanging around Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and Guy Bannister? That makes no sense. If he truly was a Marxist. Makes no sense at all.
Do you not think he was a communist?
No, I don't. I don't.
There's a quote from Reagan, which is that someone who reads, or someone who's a communist is someone who reads Marx and Lenin. And then there's another one where it says, and someone who's an
Well, I've read
anti,
Marx and Lenin. I mean,
well,
I've read Marx and Lenin,
it's,
but I'm not a communist.
it's Reagan's quote is that someone's a communist said that, you read Marx and Lenin. And then he says someone who's anti-communist is someone who understands Marx and Lenin.
Okay, there you go.
It's a pretty impactful quote if you really think about it, because like when I try and understand, like I know they label him as like, oh, he's a communist and all this. I mean, Johnson in his little back messages said that he did not believe just it was a lone nut. He thought that there was some type of Cuban involvement in there. And I think everyone, even in the government, had their doubts on the single lone assassin theory. But I think it meant a little bit more because of the height of communism back then and how scary it was that people just wanted you to go after whoever thought that they were going to be at war again. And I mean, you would think that why wouldn't they just go into Cuba if that's what they wanted in the first place? But I don't know necessarily if that's what they actually want. You know what I mean? Like it's a complicated issue. People bring up good points on both sides of the Warren Commission argument side, and then also on the conspiracy side as well too. I'm just surprised that the HSCA does not get a mention in our history books. They proved so much about the Warren Commission that was just wrong. Whether it was Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle, they interviewed Marina Oswald, or her name at that point was Miss Porter, and asked if Lee Harvey Oswald ever, owned a rifle and all this stuff. She goes, I don't know. Do you know the difference between a rifle and a shotgun? No. What's the difference? Different ammunition? He goes, okay. What? You said in the Warren Commission statement that says that you said that you pointed out Lee Harvey's rifle, but now you're saying you don't know the difference between a rifle and a shotgun. Like there's very impactful things that the HSCA was able to prove. I do think it was a bit of a whitewash towards the ending. I think they were pressured a little bit too much. They had time restraints. They had a lot of media attention as well too. And there was obviously a narrative that they had to get it wrapped up quicker because of all those time restraints, which I feel like if they would have had full access to full documentation on the CIA, I mean, when I spoke with Blakey, he felt like the CIA kind of withheld stuff from him. And I'm like, yeah, it's
definitely. Yeah, definitely.
That word national security. I mean, if you request for a document and they say it's national security reasons, they can't give it to you. But it's like our job is to look at those documents and be able to see if there is something going on more than what the official story was.
All the facts that you just mentioned are why the HSCA isn't mentioned very often in our history books, because they so clearly deviated from the Warren Commission. Even though they said that Oswald that he was the gunman, but they did so in a way that that is just not acceptable to lone gunman theorists. In fact, if you go, I think you've seen in the education forum, but also on other forums, that those who accept the Warren Commission do not like the HSCA at all. They'll use some of the HSCA's work, just the parts that they like, but they have to ignore all kinds of other things that the HSCA found. And when you ask them about the conclusions about Oswald's ties with Shaw, Ferry, and Bannister, about the acoustical evidence, about the shot from the front, about Ruby's mafia ties, and on we could go. They don't like that stuff.
I've spoken to 3 members of the Assassination Records Review Board, and I asked if Doug Horn was the only dissenter amongst them, because he's the only one I ever really hear about that ever became, like, I guess, a super critic of everything that was going on, whether it was a Zapruder film. But every single one of them, Thunheim, I mean, he believes it was Lee Harvey Oswald, but Thunheim believes it was unethical that when he requested documents for the prior death threats on Kennedy, that the Secret Service destroyed them 2 weeks after he requested for them. And then speaking to David Montague, when he's talking about going to the archives, go look at the photos of the brain, and he's looking at them and he's like, my personal opinion, which is what someone says right before they say something conspiracy. And he goes, this is Kennedy's brain. Like this is what I saw in the Zapruder film. You hear things like that, and then Tom Samoluk. I mean, he doesn't stand in the boat of going into like Richard Case Nagel and all those figures, which I don't think you need them. I think it's you really when you look at the evidence and see what happened when there was things of the cover up, what it does prove is that something is going on, whether it's unethical or whether it's conspiracy, whatever you want to say, but it wasn't a proper investigation. And I mean, it goes into which I think we talked about this on your first episode, which is like the Zapruder film alterations and certain frames that were taken out. When it gets into medical evidence, which I'm still learning, I'm trying my best to, and then also ballistics evidence thing, the public doesn't know what any of that stuff is. So your word, if you're a pathologist or if you're anybody, they're going to accept it because they just don't know. So when you get into film alterations and editing, I mean, Life magazine bought the Zapruder film and then stored it for 10 years. If the technology to manipulate things film wise or do whatever wasn't available back then, would that be reason for why they stored it for so long? I mean, what would be the reason besides having some type of government covert media asset to be like, you can't release that? But even then, they wouldn't have Life magazine hold it.
Back in '63, they had the means to alter the Zapruder film, but um, yeah, well, that's a good point. See but I think that that's another reason that the HSCA hasn't been very widely talked about among historians. They just found too much stuff that is disturbing that you can't make fit into the lone assassin theory. It just doesn't work. And uh, you know, you want to talk about science? I mean, the acoustical evidence.
Is largely rejected by both sides.
Yeah, Josiah Thompson had that evidence examined by some scientists at the firm of BBM, and uh, they ran some additional tests, and they confirmed that the HSCA scientists got it right, that they were right, that there are at least 4 gunshot impulses on that tape, and that the crosstalk is not a problem. It's not a time indicator. It was an anomaly, and that it does not, and it does not prove that the gunshot impulses occurred after the assassination. I think that much is clear. And even David Kaiser, who's really careful, and I mean I think he's way too careful, but
He was on here.
yeah, okay. Even he talking out talking about the acoustical evidence, he makes the point that it's hard to believe that it's just a coincidence that the test shots fired in Dealey Plaza during the HSCA tests there in Dealey Plaza, that those shots match in time and location as you plot them. They match the Dictabelt tape. That's an astounding coincidence. I mean,
Don't they say it was because a motorcycle cop had his microphone stuck
if
in the
that's a
on position?
coincidence, it's an amazing coincidence that you would have um, these correlations where it tracks. Each one tracks exactly where it's supposed to be at the right time, going right down that street, just 1, 2, 3, 4, right in order, right in the right place. The idea that those correlations are all just a coincidence is just unbelievable, I think.
Where did the
And yes,
where did the creation of the motorcycle cops with his microphone stuck in the on position come from?
well, he admitted it at first. I mean,
How does
we
that
know that there
damage the
was a
acoustics? That's the thing, is like that's whenever you bring up the acoustics, someone mentions that motorcycle cop scenario and says that's why it's unreliable.
well,
You
we
can't
know
trust
that
it.
there was a okay. We absolutely know that there was a microphone stuck open. I mean, that's indisputable. The only issue is whose mic was stuck open. And initially, McLean admitted that it was his mic, and that his mic would often um, stick in the open position. Then I don't know what happened, but then later on, he tried to back away from that. But Mr. Ashkenazi, one of the acoustical scientists, said, "Well, okay, look at um, however you want to think about the microphone, whose it was. Okay, in order to have the sounds that you have on that tape, those impulses, if that's if they were not made in Dealey Plaza, they would had to have been made in an exact um, duplicate of Dealey Plaza, because of the echo um, patterns, all of which were measured very precisely. He said that's just how it works out. I mean, it can't be any other way. If these impulses were not made in Dealey Plaza, then they had to have been made in an exact replica of Dealey Plaza.
I understand that with getting them to match up perfectly like that. That's like one big hell of a coincidence. If you look at the assassination, it seems like the answer to everything is, oh, it's just a coincidence. It's like there's only so many coincidences in the world. But the acoustic evidence, like I said, with the motorcycle cop is one thing that gets brought up where both sides have completely just thrown that out. So then with that little bit of just throwing out the acoustic evidence, now the whole HSCA seems to be spoiled in a lot of the people researchers' eyes as well too, whether they were able to prove some things or not. And I go, I mean, the history books can at least talk about them from the stuff they did get to prove wrong about the Warren Commission, or things that the Warren Commission just added in there and didn't seem to clarify any more than that. The HSCA just tackled more of the mob, which makes me wonder, what did they see? Like Jeremy Gunn's a name I want to talk to because I read his files and they're all like Jack Ruby stuff. And I'm like, what have you come across? I mean, I don't know if he dissents from the Warren Commission or if he thinks there was conspiracy involved. He might be straight shooter. I don't know. But there's a David, even speaking with David Kaiser, the mob influence and other aspects of things. I don't put like all my cards into that. I still believe like military industrial complex for sure. But honestly, I think it's so many varying factors. I don't think it's just one. Because
Well, at the time, you have to keep in mind that at the time, the mob was often hired by the CIA or by elements of the CIA to do dirty work, to do assassinations, to do other things, and so it isn't either or. I mean, it would actually make sense, since that's how the CIA, that's how elements of the CIA did certain assassinations. They would hire the mafia, and so it makes sense that for something like this, they would have hired the mafia again, since they'd hired them before. And the mafia, of course, had huge reasons for wanting Kennedy dead, especially Trafficante and Marcello, because he was waging JFK was waging a war on the mafia. A very
you mean RFK?
well, JFK and RFK. I mean, yeah, RFK as the Attorney General, he was the spearhead of it. But I mean, if JFK had stopped him, he would have stopped. So obviously, JFK was allowing him to do that, and it was having a devastating effect on the mafia. It was hurting their profits. They were under tremendous pressure because of this, and so they had a very strong motive for wanting JFK dead.
What do you think their reason was, the Warren Commission's reason for saying that Jack Ruby had no Dallas police connections?
Well, they were trying to make him look like another lone nut. He was just a loner. He was unbalanced, irrational. I mean, this is what they were trying to put across, and that he just had a fit of rage. He was trying to spare Jackie and Caroline the trauma of a trial, and so when he just happened to be at the Western Union, even though there was a Western Union actually in Oak Cliff where he could have gone. I mean, if he was really in a hurry to wire the money to that girl named Carlin, he could have gone to the Western Union in Oak Cliff, but instead he drove downtown to the Western Union right across the street from the police headquarters where they were transferring Oswald. And so the story was that he just happened to be at the Western Union because he needed to send money to one of his dancers, and then he realized that he saw this crowd over there. He went over in a fit of rage and he shot Oswald.
Well, that's not true because we have photos of him dressed up as a reporter at the midnight press conference correcting somebody on the
Oh
Fair
yeah, he
Play
was
for Keeping
stalking
It.
Oswald before. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
but
know. Yeah. Oh
the
yeah.
Warren Commission, to me, those are suspicious. Like, I mean, if you're a reporter and you're filming this guy talking, but we have photos of clearly Jack Ruby standing off to the back right wearing glasses. And then even if you believe Seth Cantor, who saw Ruby at Parkland Hospital, like I would
Oh
have
yeah.
thought like
Yeah.
maybe he's just a very curious guy and he thinks that he obviously knew a lot of people, despite what the Warren Commission said about him. But I mean, he was involved into like every single
Or he was
event
there
that
to
was
plant a
going on.
bullet. Yeah. Or well, I think it's entirely possible that Ruby was there to plant a bullet, but
Why do you think that?
um, well, because when Cantor identified him as having been um, at the hospital right after the shooting, um, Ruby denied it, and the Warren Commission um, supported his denial. Well, I'm just wondering, well, why would you deny? I mean, why not say that you were curious? You know, that you were a fan of the president, and like a lot of other people, you went to the hospital just to be there, just because that's where he was, that's where they were working on him. But instead he said, nope, 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 I wasn't there. Nope, nope, there's no way I was there. That makes me suspicious that he was there for nefarious reasons.
I don't know so much about planting a bullet. I definitely think he was there. I do believe Seth Cantor on that one. But did Ruby actually deny saying that he wasn't there?
He said he wasn't there. Yeah.
Do you think that's just because he was around a lot of suspicious activity, he didn't want to get drawn into maybe being an accomplice with Oswald?
Well, I think if he had just been there for an innocent reason, he would have just said so. He would have just said, oh, look, I'm like a lot of other people. I went to the hospital because that's where JFK was. I just wanted to be there. It's a natural thing. There were lots of people who gathered at the hospital for that same reason.
Yeah, but most people were outside, not inside.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. But I'm saying, why deny that you were even there in the first place if you weren't doing anything wrong? I don't understand why he would have just why he would not have just said, well, yeah, I was there. I was a fan of JFK. She actually wasn't, but he could have just said, well, I was there the same reason a lot of other people went there, because I was a fan of JFK, and I was concerned about him, and I just wanted to be there.
part where he's a fan of JFK, I mean, the Warren Commission stated that his heart went out to Jackie Kennedy and that she was welcome at his club anytime because he felt such grave loss. I think it was a story his lawyer created, if I'm not mistaken, when he was being sentenced or his
He had,
first
well,
trial.
yes, yeah. Well, actually, Ruby admitted that in a note that he wrote, and we have the note. He wrote a note to his second attorney where he said, "By the way, this story that I shot Oswald because I was trying to spare Jackie a trial. My first lawyer, he told me to say that." And that's in writing.
I'm sorry, I haven't seen that note. I've heard that was the story, but I've never seen the note before. I've watched the videotape. I like watching the footage a lot. Like if you looked, if like there was a Family Feud style thing where you had a giant screen behind me, like show me Jack Ruby, and you put that up there. There's so many footage clips of Jack Ruby just walking around, looking around at some of the most sensitive moments of every single part of like either that weekend, that day. It was just insane where I'm like, if you're not trying to get caught or deny the fact that you were even there, you look really suspicious in all of these.
Yeah. No, but that's been established that he definitely told his second attorney that his story about why he shot his initial story about why he shot Oswald was given to him by his first attorney.
Now, after he was
No
sentenced,
one
though,
disputes that. Yeah, I mean, no one disputes that.
now when he gets his first trial, what happens? How did he get a retrial?
Um, they said that the trial should not have been held at Dallas. That the jury pool was contaminated since there were so many. You know, it was an emotional issue, obviously.
But didn't he, about to say, didn't he get the death penalty? So I was like, how
He
is it?
did. He
Yeah.
got the death penalty. Yep.
So then with a
Well, see, I
retrial,
think I think he had been promised uh, that he would eventually get off with a light sentence. I mean, it wasn't unusual in Dallas for people who were found guilty of murder, but it was a murder of passion. It's a spur of the moment that they got off with a slap on the wrist with almost nothing.
well, they called it a spout of insanity.
Yeah, and so
I think the real story is he had an epileptic seizure that caused him to shoot Oswald. Where I was like, damn, dude, you had a seizure literally walking right up to the guy and decided to do that. That's how bad of a seizure it was. You didn't just fall on the ground. You managed to ghost walk all the way up to in between all these reporters and cops and shoot him right in the stomach.
but I think he was shocked by the fact that he was charged with first degree murder, and that the prosecution that the prosecutors that the prosecutors actually went after him. I think he was surprised by that, and then I think he was shocked when he got the death penalty. And I think it was at that point he decided he was at he that he'd been set up, he'd been betrayed, and so and I think he felt that even after he was granted a new trial, I just think he had lost confidence in the promises he'd been given, and I think that's why he's he started talking about a conspiracy, where he actually said in a filmed interview that there had been a conspiracy.
I mean, when it comes to new research, I mean, are there any areas you decided to look into? I'm pretty sure you probably went down a different route than most that I've talked to when it comes to probably looking more towards a mob connection. Seems like you're interested a little bit more into the mob as well, too.
No, no, no. I think the mob was a secondary player. I think that they were the hired gun, or one of the hired guns. I don't think that they were the main movers and shakers behind the plot. I mean, it's possible that like Traficante and Marcelo were a part of the discussions held by those who were higher up. It's possible. But I mean, it's just hard to say exactly how high up they were in the plot. I mean, they were powerful men. They controlled a lot of assets. They had a lot of money. But if you look at the history of the relationship between the mafia and the CIA, the CIA was always the main driver, that they were in charge, that they were the paymaster or the boss of the CIA in cases where they used them for criminal activity, mainly assassination.
Have you ever looked into Jack Ruby's visit to Cuba? And do you think that he visited Traficante? I've asked a
I
couple
do.
people this question.
Yes, I do.
I
Yeah.
believe I forget his name's Wilson, or is it Hudson? Somebody, that the reporter that was in the jail that saw a man named Ruby visit Traficante. I believe him just because he went to the FBI after Ruby shot Oswald, and he said that. And I know they call him a crackpot reporter and everything, but then a later investigation proved that Ruby did go to Havana when that guy said that Ruby was in Havana, or he saw a guy named Ruby visit Traficante.
The HSCA, developed a lot of evidence along that line, and they concluded that the reports that Ruby visited Traficante were credible.
Do you think, I mean, obviously, I've talked to Blakey, like I said, about the HSCA, but do you think that it was doomed to fail? Because they had somebody that broke into their safe and went through all the autopsy photos. Now, Blakey said it was just a low-level guy that ended up losing his status. But I go, you have to have both of those safe combinations to open up the safe that he opened up, and he went through all those autopsy photos without any gloves, and also went through a journal as well too, and left it on like a window or something like that. Where I'm just like, that's not just like, I'm curious, I'm gonna look through. This is like, I'm gonna see what's going on here. And this guy, to me, it made it seem like there was a plant. And that's how I hear from a lot of people, they don't even trust the archives. And I've asked a couple ARB members about that, just because, I mean, it is a government institution. And if, like I said, government's holding the evidence, I mean, a lot of things started to go missing. So it's like, I mean, it's not, don't say like they're in on it or anything like that, but I kind of look at it a little bit differently. That's why I think it's important to put it all online. There's so many files that are still not online, not about the stuff that is still classified, but there's plenty of stuff that was online, and now it's a bad gateway when you click on it, or error, and you can't get to the actual file. Many of Mary Farrell's documents that she has on there are like that.
Yeah. Well, I think the HSCA was a huge step forward in the investigation. I think that they did a lot of great work. I used to be very, very critical of Blakey, but the more I've researched the case, the more I've read, the more favorable my view of him has become. I think he was in a very, very difficult situation. I think he showed a lot of courage. I think he did the best job that he could at the time, given the forces that were up against him and that were doing all they could to hinder the investigation, to block the investigation. I think he did a very good job. Not a perfect job. There are a lot of things I wish he had done. I think he did. I think he did make some bad decisions, but I think overall, that the HSCA was a large step forward, and that it brought us a huge amount of important information. I mean, just look at all the information that has been gained from the HSCA medical interviews and from the Lopez report and things like that. And yes, they were sealed and everything, but they were But had it not been for the work that the HSCA did when the ARRB came along and started to unseal all these files, all those HSC files that have given us so much information would not have been there had it not been for Robert Blakey. So I've mellowed in my view of him. I think that as I said, that overall he did a good job, the best he could under the circumstances.
When it comes to the HSCA, and do you think that their proof of conspiracy, or their idea that there was a conspiracy on the basis of Jack Ruby shooting Oswald, I think that's the only thing that kept the door open for there allowed to be so many years of research that have been looking into the conspiracy aspect of things. Like if it would have been like, nope, everything was right, I feel like we wouldn't have the open transparency in documents. We wouldn't have any of it, what we have today.
Well, here you get into an area where I'm frustrated with Blakey. There were areas that they could have pursued that they didn't pursue, and things as far as the CIA angle. If you read Gaten Fonzie's book, The Last Investigation, you'll get some idea of what I'm talking about. But just things where he was holding them back from following certain leads and things like that.
Having off the books dinners about conversations like JM Wave. I've seen the documents for that.
Okay, so yeah, but
the craziest one is Scott Beckenridge explaining to Blakey about how murder is okay in certain circumstances.
Oh yeah,
He was like, let me put it to you like this. And the document goes on to talk about if you could go back in time and kill Hitler. And it was just like, that's something I see in a movie, and it's in an HSCA document where I'm like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Blakey was wise to pursue Ruby's mafia ties, since obviously, I mean,
his career in criminal racketeering. So
yeah, but for Oswald to get shot so soon after being arrested and under such suspicious circumstances. I mean, he was in the basement of the police department. You would think that would be a secure spot and that they could transfer him without his being shot, but he gets shot. And of course, at the time, this really fueled a lot of people's suspicions that that there was something going on here. I mean, here he's arrested, and barely 48 hours later, he's shot dead in the basement of the police department by a guy who was not supposed to be there. So I think that Blakey rightly saw that as an angle that ought to be pursued, and that if he could find evidence of mafia ties on the part of Ruby, that would be something that would be very important, and he did.
I would like to look through Time Magazine or Life's archives, their own personal newspaper archives. Some of that stuff probably is not online. I feel like that's a great place for them to have a lot of information on the assassination. I've come across a lot of documents from Life Magazine and reporters, but they're all CIA documents. But what about Life Magazine's newspaper archives, the stories, the headlines, everything that they ran with the side stories? I was talking to a reporter for the New York Times, and he was talking about, because they're looking at the UN in 2013 decided to relook into the death of Dag Hammarskjöld. And
Yeah.
Alan Dulles might be one of those names that caused his whole death.
Definitely.
And,
Definitely. Yep.
So when I was talking to this reporter, he talked about that he was just digging into the New York Times archives and found the story of Dag Hammarskjöld and decided to look into it and then did a bunch of research and then wrote a book about it. Where I start going, Life magazine, what about their archives? Does anybody put a subpoena on Life magazine to open up their archives or anything of that sort? And I know the newspaper's not really around anymore, but you got to this point where it's like you can still go to the whoever owns that whole establishment, or they probably know some connection to something, and then just look into every single document they have. Look around the time when they bought the Zapruder film. Look at what was going on over there. Look at the transactions. I've heard transactions of Alan Dulles, and I've seen it in a document of giving one of the Life reporters $3,000, and there's no explanation of what that $3,000 was for. Now, I'm not saying that's anything for the Zapruder film. I'm not saying any of that. But there's a lot of connections where there's meetings and plenty of CIA documents to show that there was media assets and Times, what was it? DC Times or something like that back then. There's a list of like 14 or 15 different people that were like vice presidents or presidents of these giant newspaper corporations, where it's or Operation Mockingbird. But you start going, is anybody going to subpoena any information on these people? How many documents that could be still sealed that could have information on these people?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't, I don't, I don't see, I don't see any chance of that stuff being subpoenaed, because that would have to be done by a government entity. And right now, anyway, I don't see a lot of interest on the part of the government in reopening the case, or following up on this, on all the new evidence that has been found over the last 20 years. It'd be nice if they would.
Yeah. We could all hope, but at least the research community and people like yourself have been looking into it for a long time, at least educating the public about it as well, too. I mean, doing podcasts is pretty important when you're just giving out information as well, too. I mean, I appreciate the time you gave me again to talk about this. I've tried my best. I think we didn't have a plan for this episode to talk about what we were going to talk about. I just had some questions on some things, and the medical evidence has been an area I kind of stayed away from. Just because it seems like that is where the most fighting and controversial stuff happens in the community of things, where you really can't get an answer. So I'm kind of more looking at like some simple weird things that I think would raise questions for anybody. Like, how come you shoot a president, shoot a cop, and then go to a theater? And then also, how do you, like, he got a job there a month before Kennedy had 2 other speeches in Dallas. He could have took a shot when Kennedy was sitting at a podium, standing still, took the day off work, didn't leave a note, said, I'm a patsy. There's a lot of things that just raise suspicious, like, to anybody.
Well, I think the medical evidence is, I think if you go to the major JFK assassination forums, like the Education Forum, and then there's another one that's just called the JFK Assassination Forum. I think you'll see that lone gunman theorists have no good answer for the medical evidence, especially about the fragments in the back of the head, the bullet fragments in the back of the head. I mean, there's just I mean, even their own wound ballistics expert, Larry Sturtevant, has admitted that the ammo that Oswald allegedly used, simply would not leave any fragments on the back of a skull. It just wouldn't happen. It's never happened in the history of forensic science. In all the tests that have been done, it's never happened. It didn't happen in the Warren Commission's tests. And so I think that's a really strong area of evidence. In fact, it's interesting, in the JFK assassination forum, the Warren Commission apologists there strenuously tried to argue that there were no fragments on the back of the head, incredibly enough. And of course, we have plenty of evidence that there were fragments on the back of the head, and the Clark panel identified them. The HSCA medical experts identified them. The ARRB pathologist identified at least one fragment back there. And so that's a huge problem for the lone gunman theory. I mean, those fragments should not be there if the kind of ammunition used was the kind of ammunition that Oswald is said to have used. They shouldn't be there, but yet they are.
Was there ever an explanation of why it was FMJ rounds?
Well, those are the kinds of rounds that they found in the 6th floor window. So,
okay,
yeah,
it's just weird. It doesn't seem like common ammunition.
And so they assume, so since those were the kinds of rounds that they found in the window, they said, okay, well then, these are the kinds of bullets that hit Kennedy and Connally. But see, now that has become a huge Achilles heel in the lone gunman theory because of the medical evidence, because of the findings of those fragments on the back of the skull, and because it has become obvious that those fragments could not have been made by an FMJ bullet,
because it doesn't separate.
Well, not at that point, no. It can separate inside the skull, and when it does, it separates into a few pieces, not a snowstorm of tiny fragments. It separates into maybe 6 or 7, 8 or 9, 10 fragments, and that's what you had in the Warren Commission's wound ballistics tests. That's how they that's what happened every time. There was no big snowstorm of fragments like we see in the autopsy x-rays. It just didn't happen.
I hope it doesn't become a topic that's just going to keep going like this till the end of time, where people are just fighting.
I think it will. I see, because I think that there are those who they would still believe in the lone gunman theory, even if you had, say that you found a note in among Allen Dulles' belongings where he signed and dated it, where he admitted that he was involved in a plot to kill John F. Kennedy. I think there would still be those who would say, well, I mean, even if they were able to verify that it was his handwriting, you would still have those who would come up with just far-fetched explanations. Well, he was playing a practical joke. He was, well, whatever. I mean, they would just, because they don't want to believe that an American president was killed by a highly placed conspiracy, and that our news media helped to cover it up. They just don't want to believe that. I mean, in a way, I can't blame them. I mean, it's disturbing. I would much rather believe that it was just a single guy. He was just a lone nut. It was just a fluke. That would be a lot more comforting to believe than the conspiracy view. But I just think that the evidence overwhelmingly favors the conspiracy view.
Well, Mike, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. I really do. It was good chatting with you again. Is there a place where people can find your links?
Yes. You want me to give you the link? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So if you
Oh,
want to
okay.
say it
Hold
off,
on.
and I'll link it in the description.
Okay, hold on just a second here.
I know you keep changing sites all around,
Oh,
so
no. I've only changed once in the last 7 years, and I'm not going to change again. Hold on just a second. I'll get that for you right now. Yeah, I had to change because my old
I got the Drive link where some of your links are, but that's about it.
my old host proved unreliable. I thought I was going to have it there forever. Okay. Sorry. All right. The address is sites, sites.google.com/view/JFK assassination website. So, okay. JFK assassination website, all one word, and then /home. So sites.google.com/view/JFK assassination website /home. And that's it.
And I'm going to link that in the description so everyone can be able to check out your links as well, too. And thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.